Hi everyone, I'm here to talk about how to make motherships that launch fighters. And I originally did this when I was really a very brand new at programming, very much a novice. And I was surprised that it was less difficult than I had expected. So I figured I'd do a tutorial on this because these could be some pretty fun ships and they're not so hard to make. So let me start here. This is my mothership called Object Ally. So in the create event, I have n2 equals 6. This will dictate how many fighter ships I make. Oh, also as I go over this tutorial, I'm not going to go over every, I added some extra stuff you don't need, and I'm going to skip some of that. I'm going to go over kind of the basics. So that for this ship, I added a screen wrap. I added some stuff to help it get around meteors better. For the fighters, I added just a little bit of code to have fighters spread out from each other a bit. So I added just some extra bells and whistles that don't make a huge difference. And so I'm going to skip a lot of that extra stuff and just talk about the basics of how to just get this working quickly and easily. So right here, I have a global variable mother equals ID. So this global variable, it's important that it's global, is that other objects can see this variable. And so this global variable mother equals the ID of this particular mothership. So chasing them, this is the enemies you're going to chase equals instance nearest xy enemies. Enemies is a parent object. So I have many different enemy ships, and they're all under the parent object enemies. Either parents or they're either children or grandchildren of this object. And I also have the ability to give a kill command, so rather than chase the nearest enemy, I could have them chase something else. That's totally not needed for this. I'll skip the screen wrap, it's not necessary. This is how the ship moves. So if instance exists enemies, if there's an enemy to chase, then var direction equals point direction, chasenem.x, chasenem.y, so that's the nearest enemy, unless I specified something else with kill command, but otherwise, basically the x position of the nearest enemy, the y position of the nearest enemy, so xy are the xy of this object. So if you draw a line from the xy of this object to the xy of the nearest enemy, you have a vector, a direction. So vector equals point direction from this xy position to enemy's xy position. Impulse equals 150, and then Lx equals length direct x, and then you have impulse, and then the direction. So this basically gives a force in a direction, and this is the x component of that vector. This is the y component, length y. It's the y component of this vector with impulse and direction. And then you can physics apply impulse, xy, length direct x, length direct y. Well, I'm not speaking very well right now. So basically what this will do is apply a force. It's a constant force in the direction of the nearest enemy. And it only does that in this case if the point distance to the nearest enemy is greater than 500. You don't have to do this, but I didn't want my mothership to actually crash into the enemy. I wanted my mothership to fly near the enemy and then have the fighters take it out. So once it's closer than 500 away from the enemy, it stops moving towards the enemy and kind of lets the fighters do their job. If HP ship gets less than 0, basically the ship gets destroyed. Add some like particle effects, fireworks, not necessary but can make the game look cool. And I added some screen shake, again not really necessary. So here is where the fighters get created. So if n2 is greater than 0, remember in the create event I made n2 equal to 6, so n2 starts at 6. If it's greater than 0, do all this, and each time n2 minus 1. So each time it makes a fighter. And really all you really need is this line of code here. With instance create layer, xy layer, fighter. This creates a fighter exactly where this Mothership is. And this part is completely unnecessary. This line of code, as you see, looks a whole lot like the line of code above. It gives the fighter a direction and an impulse. So basically, you could have the fighter just appear in the mothership, have the fighter fly on its own out, or you could launch the fighter with a speed and direction, and this mothership will launch the fighter in the direction of the nearest enemy. Not at all needed, but it can add a little extra flair. And then I put stop times length directs x, stop times length directs y. Direct y, I gave, basically, I can make stop equal to 0, and then there's no impulse. I have a few things like that in various ships, so that I have basically certain events or cutscenes where I can make this variable 0 to make certain ships stop moving. So that's kind of the most important thing. It makes about 6 fighters. It's really not important that it launches them, but it makes about 6 fighters. And it sets the global variable mother to ID. So in here, now let me look at one of my fighters, ally fighter. Create. First of all, mother2 equals mother. So in the other ship, mother equals ID, and now mother2 equals mother. So what I've done is basically this ship knows that its mother is the global variable mother. So basically, there's going to be hopefully many motherships, but at the time that this particular fighter was created, its value was set to, at the time this fighter was created, this global variable equaled the ID of the mothership that made it. So because you don't want the fighters to go back to some other mothership, you want the fighters to fly back to the mothership that created them. And so at the time of creation of this ship, the global variable mother equaled the specific ID of the mothership that created it. So let's go. So some health. It's not a very tough ship. It gets destroyed really easily. Payload equals 2. Basically, it's going to fire twice, and once it fires twice, it's going to fly back to the mothership. I'll go into how that works. Okay, chase them. Basically, chase enemy equals instance nearest enemy. If instance exists, this is not important, but basically there's chase enemy and there's chase carrier. I've designed these fighters to have a preference for attacking carriers over fighters or over other vessels. That if it has an opportunity to attack either a carrier or a fighter, it will go for the carrier. So chase NM equals instance nearest enemies, but if instance exists smart 2, this is the enemy mothership, then chase carrier will equal instance nearest smart 2. And then, but if instance does not exist, if there is no smart 2, if there is no enemy carrier, then chase carrier will just equal chase NM. Now this right here is kind of embarrassing. It's a completely unnecessary line of code. And I think I mentioned earlier that I was pretty much a novice when I did this, and I did not know what I was doing. I was pretty much stumbling around. Something wasn't working. I forget what wasn't working, and I was kind of trying some random stuff. And, you know, it didn't break the code, but it's just completely unnecessary. So, as you can see here, mother2 equals what, upon creation, mother2 equals whatever the global variable mother equaled. At the time of creation, the global variable mother equaled the specific mothership that created the ship. So what I should have done is just have, if instance exists mother2, point distance mother2, this flies back to the mother. This should all just say mother2, but for really no good reason, I had mother3 equal mother2 and then use mother3 instead. Completely unnecessary. It's kind of embarrassing, but just goes to show that I was a complete novice when I did this, and this is like just really foolish coding, but it works, so I haven't fixed it. So if instance exists mother 3, so this now has the ID of the mothership that created the fighter, because mother 2 has the ID of the mothership that created the fighter. So very unnecessarily, I am using mother 3 now. If point distance, so if the distance to the mothership that created this fighter is less than 50, and instance exists enemies, then payload equals 2. And chase ship x equals chase and m.x. Remember, chase and m equals instance nearest enemies. So if I added this and instance exists enemies, because what I don't want to happen is assign chase ship x to chase and m.x, but what if there's no enemies? Then chase and m.x won't exist, and the game will crash. So I just added if instance exists enemies, then I'll run this line of code, which is chase ship x equals chase and m.x, chase ship y equals chase and m.y. Basically what's happening here is each fighter has a payload of 2. They can fire twice. They'll chase the enemies and fire twice, but when they run out of payload, when they run out of firepower, then rather than chase the enemies, they will chase the mothership, fly back to the mothership. When they get within 50 of the mothership, their payload's back at 2 again, and this sets them to chase the enemy again. But I only want to set them to chase the enemy again if the enemy exists. So that's why I added if instance exists enemies, just protect your game from crashing. So again here, if instance exists enemies, let's see, what is this? Okay, I'm going to skip this. This is the line of code where I tell my fighters to spread out. And it's a little bit unnecessarily messy because I think the, let's see, yeah, instance nearest. So I think the instance nearest not me was not available, or at least I didn't know how to use it. So I tried instance nearest, and then the instance nearest was always myself, always this fighter. And then the distance to the instance nearest was always 0 because it was always myself. And so what this does is it temporarily changes the x value of this. So var x equals the x value of this ship. But then I change the x value of this ship, so it's actually no longer there. And then it compares instance nearest to this x, that is where the x value of the ship used to be. So it finds whatever ally fighter is nearest to this point that's not myself, that's not this ally fighter. And what's a much better way to do this is instance nearest not me. I think that is now available. And rather than do this like make the ship move so that the instance nearest is not itself, so this should not be necessary now because I think you can do the instance nearest not me, but I'll have to check that. But this is not really necessary. It just has the fighters spread out a bit. As you can see, the fighters will only spread out if the enemy they're chasing is far away. And so in the scene I'm going to show you, the enemies will almost never be far away, so this will almost never kick in. There's just a little extra flair, and it doesn't really do that much. I just wanted my fighters to spread out a little bit. Okay, so let's get to where the code becomes a little more important. So if instance exists mother 3, so that's the mothership that made this fighter, and if payload is greater than or equal to 1. So basically if the ship still has firepower, then it can still chase the enemies. It doesn't have to go back to the mothership. So if the ship has firepower and enemies exist, and point distance to the mothership is less than 1400, basically I've told my fighters don't go farther than a certain amount from the mothership. If you get too far to the mothership, just go back to the mothership. And if point distance, the nearest enemy is less than 4800, this is not really necessary, but what I decided, if the enemies are sufficiently far away, I want my fighters to just fly straight back to the mothership just to make sure they're all completely full on firepower. And they're just all right there. When I found that the mothership just fight, these are just a little tweak, but I found the motherships seem to just fight a little bit better when all the fighters make sure they're full on firepower. when the enemies are far away, so that when they do get to the enemy, they're fully loaded. So basically, when you've got firepower, when there's enemies, when you're not too far from the mothership, and not too far from the enemies, then you chase the enemies. So this could be anything. I should probably should have named these variables different. Some of these names don't fully make sense, but direction carrier. Remember I said chase carrier. Let's see. Yeah, chase carrier equals instance nearest smart 2. That's the enemy carrier ship. So the direction of the carrier ship equals point direction xy. So this position, the xy of this fighter, and then chase carrier.x, chase carrier.y. So that's the direction of the nearest enemy carrier. And then just dir, direction equals point direction, chasing them. So chasing them is nearest enemy, chase carrier, nearest carrier. So I've had my fighters kind of favor going after the carriers. Impulse. This shouldn't be called impulse because I'm actually going to use force instead. That's why this number is so much bigger. So this probably should be named force, but oh well. I said impulse equals 1200. And then Lx length through xx, the impulse, the x value, the x part of the vector that is defined by the impulse and direction, Ly, the y part of the vector that's defined by impulse and direction. And then same thing here with the carrier. So this is for putting force or impulse or force in this case towards the nearest enemy, and this is for putting force towards the nearest carrier. So if point distance chase an enemy is greater than 50, you don't really need this, but again, I didn't particularly want my fighters to exactly intentionally crash into the enemy, so they only move towards the enemy if the distance is greater than 50. And then if point distance to the nearest carrier is less than 1,000, so basically it's only going to run this code here if the nearest carrier is far away, sufficiently far away. Then if the nearest carrier is sufficiently far away, and if the speed of, no, not, sorry, I said this backwards. If the nearest carrier is sufficiently close, within 1,000, and then if the speed of the carrier is not undefined, my game is crashing because I would call on a carrier speed and it was undefined at times, and that was causing me issues. So if the if the chase carrier, basically nearest carrier dot phi speed x is not undefined, and the chase carrier dot phi speed y is not undefined, then run this code, which is physics apply force. So LXC, so this is the y component of the vector, x component of the vector, and so from x point, x coordinate, y coordinate, and then LXC, LXY. So this applies a force in the direction of the nearest carrier. So to summarize this again, if the nearest enemy is at least 50 away, and if the nearest carrier is less than 1,000 away, and if the speed of the carrier is not undefined, then it applies a force towards that carrier. But all this only happens if the payload is greater than 1, enemies exist, and I'm not too far from my mothership, and I will only go towards the enemy if I'm not like too far from the enemy. And so this is how the motherships, so this is how the fighter ships, they will chase the enemy until they're close, then they will fire their payload. When their payload runs out, then they will chase the mothership. And then once they make contact with the mothership, they will reload their payload, then they'll chase the enemy again. Then they'll fire on the enemy, and then run out of payload, and then they will again chase their mothership again to reload their payload. So it's pretty simple. A little extra something I added is, notice X, it doesn't just say the LXC, so it's not just moving in the direction of the carrier, but it's moving in the direction of the carrier mostly, but I also have plus 10 times the phi speed of the carrier and 10 times the phi speed y of the carrier. So what this does is the force is not just constant. If it was just LXC, it'd always be a constant force directly in the direction of the carrier it chases. But it actually applies, it accounts for the speed of the carrier. So if the carrier is moving in a certain direction, if the carrier is moving in, say, the x direction, then the x force will be greater. If the carrier is moving in the y direction, then the y force will be greater. And this will cause the ship to not just fly directly towards the fighter will not just fly directly towards the ship it's chasing, but the fighter will actually fly towards where the ship is going. This is important not just for cutting off the ship, going where it's going, but I have these fighters pretty simple. They just fire in whatever direction they're facing. In this way, the fighter is not just facing directly where the ship is, it's facing where the ship is going. And so this gives these fighters the ability to shoot a moving target and actually hit the mark. And so you can play around with these numbers, make it 10, 15, 5. But if you get it just right, this can really help the fighter aim and then help the fighter catch the vessel it's attacking. So this is how it goes after the nearest carrier, if the nearest carrier is within 1,000. If the nearest carrier is not within 1,000, then it goes after the nearest enemy, assuming that the nearest enemy is within 1,000. So it doesn't really chase anything that's more than 1,000 away. Okay. So here's where, let's see. Okay, yes, so here. If mother exists, and if enemies exist, and if payload is less than 1, or if the distance to mother is less than 1,400, or if the distance to the enemy is greater than, if the distance to the mother is greater than 1,400, or if the distance to the enemy is greater than 4,800. So what this is at what point the fighter will go back towards the mothership. If payload becomes less than 1, the fighter goes towards the mothership. If the fighter is more than 1,400 away from the mothership, the fighter will go towards the mothership. Or if the nearest enemy is sufficiently far away, the fighter will go towards the mothership. And so point direction xy, mother 3.x, mother 3.y, so that direction points in the direction of the mothership. Impulse 1,200, and so then the x component of the vector. So impulse and direction, you have a vector, points towards the mothership, the x component of that vector, y component of that vector, and then you apply a force in that direction towards the mothership. And it only does that if the mothership is more than 25 away, because when you're as long as you're within 50 away, you've reloaded anyway, so there's really no point. So when you're within 25 away, it does this, and after that, it doesn't really need to move towards the mothership anymore. So that's how it goes towards. So it goes towards the mothership if it runs out of firepower or it's far away. And then let's not forget the code up here. Once it gets to the mothership, if point distance to the mothership is less than 50, the payload's recharged, and then it no longer goes towards the mothership because chase ship X, chase ship Y becomes chase m.x, chase m.y. So here we go. If instance exists mother3. Wait a moment. Did I even use this line of code? If instance exists mother3, and if payload is less than 1, chase ship x equals mother3.x. Chase ship y equals mother3.y. So if the payload is less than 1, this chase ship is defined by the mothership. But if the distance to the mother becomes less than 50, chase ship x becomes chasenem.x, chasenem.y. And now that I'm looking over this code again, I did this a while back, I'm not sure I even used this. I'm not sure this effectively does anything. As I said, I was a complete novice when I did this, and I definitely have some unnecessary lines of code in here. So let's look over this again. If the mothership exists, if payload is less than 1, it's going to move towards the mothership. But if the mothership doesn't exist, or if payload's more than 1, no, it's not going to call on this. Instead, if payload is, that's for firing. I'll look at that later. So yeah, if it has payload, and it's not too far from the mothership, it goes towards the nearest carrier or nearest enemy. If it runs out of payload, it goes towards the nearest mothership. And I'm pretty sure this does absolutely nothing. I had plans for this. I had plans for having, this is now assigned towards the mothership, but up here it's assigned towards the nearest enemy. I think originally I was going to use this to decide where the fighter goes, and I ended up doing it a different way. So this is a completely unnecessary line of code. I don't need this. I don't need that. I should make sure I'm not calling on this anywhere else. I think I'm not using this, but just in case I refer this object somewhere, I don't want to crash my game. So I'll take more time to look over this to make sure I can really get rid of that, but I think that does absolutely nothing. Okay, so that's basically it. It goes towards the mother when it's out of payload, and it goes towards the enemy when it has payload and it's not too far from the mother. And the other thing I should point out here is the ship has to actually fire on something. So let's see. Let's see where I fire. Here we go, here we go. Okay. If instance exists enemies, if the enemy exists, if cooldown is less than 1, so I want there to be some time between firing. And so notice after you fire, cooldown becomes 20. So there's just some time between. I don't want to just fire everything at once. So to fire and then fire, but not like fire almost at the same time. So just look at cooldown. And if cooldown is less than 1, and if payload is greater than 1, so if it actually has a payload, and if point distance to the nearest enemy is less than 1,000, then with instance create layer, so it's going to create friend fire. This is the fireball basically. the ally fireball, you might say. And then the enemy fireball will have a different name. Instance create layer length x plus length. So this basically, I make the fireball not get created in the center of the ship, but I want the fireball to be created on the nose of the ship. So length direct x, so that's like length direct x, I think, is defined by the length of the ship, or the object. So x, xy, coordinate of, I guess, the center of the object, plus the length of the object, length direct x. Let's see. I have to go over this code again, but phi rotation, this will affect the direction. So basically the length of the object is the x coordinate of the length, the y coordinate of the length, and there's a direction. Let me figure out why I put 0 here. There's a lot of stuff I've forgotten. I'm doing this kind of to instruct, but also to refresh myself. And I'm forgetting why this is 0. Not sure it has to be 0. I might leave that a mystery. It can be 0 and it works. Not sure it has to be 0. I have to look up what that does exactly, but in a rough summary, I'm making a fireball appear at the nose of the ship. And I'm giving it an impulse. And the impulse is a local impulse. And the local is important. So let's see. So 0, 0. So because it's local, 0, 0 is defined by the x and y coordinates of the fighter. And then the x impulse is 0, but it has a y impulse. What this does is it gives an impulse in the direction that the ship is facing. And this is how the ship aims, actually. So because it's a local impulse, it's not just in the y direction, it's in the y direction in relation to how the ship is facing. So this, because it's a local impulse in the y direction, rather than just like fire always up or always down, it fires in what the ship would be considered to be up or down depending on where the ship is facing. So this basically fires in the direction that the ship is facing. So that's how this aims. It just always fires in the direction that the ship is facing. And remember the line of code where I talked about how the ship flies? So the ship has a force in the direction of the nearest enemy, but not just in the direction of the nearest enemy, but it actually adds the speed of the nearest enemy, lets the speed of the nearest enemy actually affect the force applied. And so since like the x coordinate of the enemy's speed affects the x force and the y coordinate of the enemy's speed affects the y force, this will affect the direction the ship is facing. So the ship isn't just moving towards, the fighter doesn't just move towards where the enemy ship is, it moves towards where the enemy ship is going. And for the same reason, the fighter will not just face where the enemy ship is. The fighter will face where the enemy ship is going, because the fighter will face the direction of where it's going. And you might ask, well, why is the fighter facing the direction of where it's going? Well, it's because of how I assigned the center of mass. So I was making this really, really simple. So let's go to my sprites, and I'll show you how I did this. This is simple. It's kind of juvenile, but I really was a total beginner when I did this. Let me find this ship. It's one of these sprites. Here we go. Center of mass is here. So when I apply a force, I'm applying it from here. So if I apply a force in a certain direction, it's applied from where this is, and which means it's going to cause the ship to fly in, to face in the direction where the force is applied, because the center of mass is in the front of the ship. So the force is in the direction of, not just the direction of the enemy, but it lets the x component and y component of the enemy's speed affect the direction. Therefore, this fighter will face in the direction of the enemy. So let me go back. So it faces in the direction of the enemy and it fires in the direction that it faces. So that's how these chase enemies, that's how they aim at enemies. Okay, let's go back here. So that is really basically it. So to kind of recap, Mothership, let's go here. Mothership will make a fighter. At the time the mothership makes the fighter, global mother equals the ID of the mothership. Fighter gets made upon creation. Mother 2 equals the global mother, which is the ID of the mothership that created. Because I was just being foolish, I went and did this whole mother 3 equals mother 2 and then put mother 3 in all these places instead of mother 2. I could just get rid of this and change mother 3 to mother 2. Maybe I will do that. I'm just not doing it right now. And then this. So then at that point, if there is a payload, if it has firepower, if enemies exist, if it's not too far from the mother and not too far from the nearest enemy, it will go towards the nearest enemy. Whether that, with this, it'll favor the nearest carrier, but otherwise it will just go towards the nearest enemy, as long as the nearest enemy is not too far away. It will allow the x coordinate of the enemy's speed, the x speed of the enemy to affect the x force, and the y speed of the enemy to affect the y force. So that it doesn't just go towards the nearest enemy, but it will go towards where the enemy is going. It will face towards where the enemy is going. Therefore, it will fire towards where the enemy is going. And then once it runs out of its firepower, just as a payload of 2, it will then chase the mothership instead of the enemy and go towards the mothership. When it gets close to the mothership, it will then have firepower again and then be again chasing the enemies. So this just allows the ship to chase. This just allows the ship to chase enemies and then go back to reload. So it's not completely trivial, but it's not too complicated either. And really, a total novice was able to pull this off because that was me. And I think this line here just says it all. I was a complete novice. Only a novice would have done this. So I did that when I made this, so a novice could do this. So let me just show these in action. So here, I'll launch my game. So this is my game, Treacherous Space. So if you're interested in this, I put a link to my game if you want to get it. So these are my motherships launching fighters. Here, I'll just start a new game. So the way this level works is there's a big battle and the allies have been ambushed by an overwhelming force, and your job basically is to run away and get the word out to what has happened. And I am running. Well, oops, and I lost, but that's okay. So that's it. That's how you make carriers that launch fighters. It may not be trivial, but it's not too complicated either. So I hope that's helpful. And yeah, if you want to try out the game, it's available at the link below. So thank you for watching.